My parents refused to help me pay for college, and now they expect me to give them $150,000 for my sister's wedding, so I refused, telling them the same words they told me many years ago. But just then, my sister barged into my apartment. I grew up in a small town in a modest two-story house with my parents and my older sister, Grace. She was only 2 years older than me, but sometimes it felt like we lived in completely different worlds. My dad owned a small diner that generated enough to keep us comfortable while Mom stayed home and occasionally helped out at the restaurant. It wasn't a lavish life, but we managed well, most of us did. Honey, that presentation was absolutely brilliant. I remember Mom gushing one evening after a school event. "You're going to go so far in life. You're so talented." I was standing in the doorway, still clutching my own science fair certificate, but no one seemed to notice. It was always like that. Grace was the star, and I was the shadow. That was the pattern of my childhood. Grace got the latest iPhone while I inherited her old one with the cracked screen. She wore designer clothes while I got her hand-me-downs. Every family gathering became a showcase of Grace's achievements. "Did you hear Grace's SAT scores?" Dad would say proudly to our relatives. "Top percentile. And she's president of the debate club, too." I learned to fade into the background during these conversations, knowing that my respectable scrapes and my position as treasurer of the ecology club wouldn't merit a mention. It's not that I did poorly. I did well, but in our house, well, might as well have been synonymous with failure. "Stella," Mom told me once as I helped her fold laundry, "you should seriously think about practical career options. Maybe something in sales or service. There's nothing wrong with honest work." The word stung, but I'd grown used to the constant reminders of my supposed limitations. What I hadn't grown used to was the way they seemed to actively work to reinforce them. Looking back now, I realized that those early years were laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. The constant comparisons, the subtle put-downs, the clear message that I was somehow less than my sister, it all left marks that would take years to heal. But sometimes, the deepest wounds become the strongest motivations, and my family had no idea how their treatment would eventually come back to shape all of our futures. I still remember the day Grace received her college acceptance letter. The entire house erupted in celebration. Mom cooked her favorite dinner, Dad brought home a bottle of expensive wine, and they spent the whole evening making plans for her future. "Our brilliant girl is going to one of the best universities in the city." Mom couldn't stop beaming. "We've been saving for this moment since you were born, honey." I sat silently at the table, picking at the food on my plate, trying to imagine what my own celebration would be like in 2 years. I should have known better. When my turn came, the response couldn't have been more different. I'd worked hard to maintain good grades, joined clubs, and even took extra courses to boost my college applications. But none of it seemed to matter. College. Mom's laugh was sharp and dismissive when I brought up the subject. "Stella, be realistic. We simply can't afford to send you to. Besides, you're not really college material." "But what about all the money you saved for Grace?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dad cleared his throat awkwardly. "That was different. Grace had a clear path, exceptional grades. Well, you're more suited for practical work. Speaking of which, I could use another waitress at the diner." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I could work while I study," I pleaded. "Please, just help me get started. We could borrow from relatives or take out a loan. I'll pay back every penny with interest. I'll even put it in writing with a lawyer." "We never borrow from anyone on principle," Mom said coldly. "We don't borrow money, and we're not going to change our principles for you. You need to accept your limitations and find a suitable job." I spent that night crying in my room, but by morning, determination had replaced my tears. I went to the only people who had ever truly seen me, my grandparents. "Grandpa, Grandma, I need your help." I tearfully explained everything to them at their kitchen table. "I can't just give up on college. I can't." Grandpa's eyes welled up with a mix of anger and sadness. "We don't have savings, honey, but let me see what I can do." No granddaughter of mine is going to have her dreams crushed like this. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. First, the disappointment of the bank rejecting our loan application. Then the shocking moment when Grandpa announced he was selling his old country house and the land it sat on. The sale of the property provided exactly enough for my college tuition. I applied to study investment management in a city far from home, as far as I could get from the constant reminders of my family's lack of faith in me. The day I left, Mom and Dad didn't even come to say goodbye. Only my grandparents were at the bus station, Grandma hugging me tight while Grandpa wiped away what he tried to pretend weren't tears. From that day on, I cut ties with my parents completely. When holidays came around and I had to return to town, I stayed with my grandparents in their now smaller house. Their sacrifice meant everything to me, and every time I stepped into their modest home, I was reminded of what real family support looked like. After 4 years of hard work, I finally graduated with my degree in investment management. I returned to my hometown with big dreams and a freshly printed diploma, but reality hit hard. The job market wasn't exactly welcoming to new graduates, and I spent weeks sending out applications without any promising responses. I finally landed a position at a small trading firm. It wasn't the prestigious investment firm I'd envisioned working for, but it was a start. I found a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, paid for with my own money. Then came the call I never expected. Stella, Grace's voice was sugar-sweet over the phone. It's been ages. You should come over for dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up. Something in her tone should have warned me, but I agreed. Maybe time had changed things. Maybe we could finally have a real relationship as adults. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Grace's house that evening, I knew immediately that I'd walked into a trap. My parents were already there, along with Grace's fiancé, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who barely acknowledged my existence. The interrogation started as soon as we sat down to eat. So, Stella, Mom began, her fork suspended in midair. Tell us about this job of yours. I'm working at a trading firm, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's small, but Grace interrupted with a laugh. Trading firm? You mean those discount outlets? Honestly, you didn't need a college degree for that. Anyone could walk in off the street and get that job. Unlike Grace, Mom smiled, who's a manager at the City Bank. And Thomas here is a lawyer at Anderson and Piercy. Grace's fiancé nodded smugly. Top law firm in the state. I told you college wasn't necessary for you, dear Mom sighed. Such a waste of your grandfather's property. Dad chuckled, swirling his wine glass. Hey, my offer still stands. I could use a well-educated waitress at the diner. Think how impressed the customers would be. Want fries with that? From someone with a college degree. They all laughed, except me. I stared down at my plate, picking at my food like I used to as a child. Where did you say you live now? Grace asked, even though I hadn't mentioned it yet. I found a place on Cider Street, I answered quietly. The table erupted in theatrical gasps. Cider Street. Grace's eyes widened with feigned concern. Oh, Stella, that's literally the worst neighborhood in town. She paused for effect. Well, you know, the people who can't afford anything better live there. Riffraff. You mean beggars, Mom whispered theatrically, and they all laughed again. Something inside me snapped. For years of distance hadn't changed a thing. They were still the same cruel, judgmental people they'd always been. I stood up so abruptly that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. You know what? I'd rather be riffraff than be like any of you, I spat. At least I got where I am on my own, without taking advantage of anyone or living off Daddy's money. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, ignoring their protests and accusations. As I walked out into the night, I promised myself that would be the last time I was in their presence. Life has a funny way of surprising you. Just when you think you've hit a dead end. I was still working at the small trading firm, doing the best I could but feeling stuck. Then my phone rang one afternoon. It was Lisa, my old college roommate. Stella, "You're not going to believe this," she practically shrieked with excitement. "Remember how we always talked about working for Maxwell Investment Group? They're opening an office in your city, and they're looking for new talent. I've already put in a good word for you." My heart started to race. Maxwell was one of the biggest names in investment management. I spent that night updating my resume and the next week preparing for the interview. When I walked into their temporary office, I felt like everything in my life had led to this moment. The interview wasn't easy. They grilled me on everything from market trends to specific investment strategies. But all those extra hours I'd put in at my current job, all the extra research I'd done on my own time, it all paid off. A week later, I got the call. I was in. From day one, I threw myself into the work. While others went home at 5, I'd stay late, developing new investment strategies and refining my project proposals. My first big project was managing a portfolio for a mid-sized tech company. When it yielded a 40% return in the first quarter, people started to take notice. "Stella, this is exceptional work," my supervisor said during my mid-year review. Along with his praise came a bonus that was larger than my entire annual salary at the previous firm. But it wasn't enough. I worked harder, took on bigger projects, built a reputation for turning struggling investments into gold mines. The bonuses kept getting bigger, and I had a plan for every penny. 2 years after starting at Maxwell, I walked into a luxury car dealership. The salesman probably thought I was lost until I pointed at their top-of-the-line model and said, "I'll take that one." An hour later, I was pulling up to my grandparents' house in a gleaming new car with a giant red bow on top. Grandpa's jaw dropped when I handed him the keys, but I wasn't finished. The next month, I closed on a stunning apartment in Dallas, the city's most prestigious new development. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a view that made you feel like you owned the entire city. I was walking out of my building one morning, coffee in hand, when I heard a familiar voice. "Stella." It was Grace, in her designer workout clothes, looking like she'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "Oh, I live here," I said casually, gesturing to the penthouse level of the building. "Just bought it, actually." The look on Grace's face was priceless. A mixture of disbelief, shock, and something else. For the first time in our lives, I saw envy in my perfect sister's eyes. A week after my run-in with Grace, my phone rang. Seeing my parents' number on the screen was surprising enough. They hadn't called me in years. Even more surprising was that they were in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. When they walked into my apartment, their expressions were priceless. Mom's eyes darted from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture, while Dad stood awkwardly by the entrance, as if afraid to touch anything. "This is quite impressive," Mom finally managed to say, running a finger along my marble kitchen counter. "You must be doing very well." "I am," I replied simply, offering them seats on my Italian leather sofa. They exchanged glances before Mom cleared her throat. "Well, actually, we have some news. Grace is getting married to Thomas. They announced it last month at the engagement party." An engagement party I hadn't been invited to, of course. "They're planning the wedding for 6 months from now," Mom continued, her voice taking on that pleading tone I remembered from childhood. "We've offered to pay for half the expenses, as is traditional." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "But it seems the total budget is, well, it's 300,000. I'll most joke Heaton me water. 300,000. I'll most joke Heaton me water. 300,000. Thomas's family has certain expectations," Mom explained quickly. "They're very prominent in the community. We announced we'd cover half before we knew the amount, and now..." She trailed off, looking at me significantly. "Now you need $150,000, I finished for her." "Exactly." Mom brightened. "And since you're also doing so well, living in this beautiful apartment, working at such a prestigious firm, you want me to give you the money?" I stated flatly. "A loan," Dad interrupted. "We're asking for a loan." We'll pay you back, of course. We'll even have it notarized. We know it's a lot, Mom said quickly, but we can't back out now. It would be so embarrassing with Thomas's family. They expect a certain level, like when I wanted to go to college. I interrupted. When I begged you for help. When I offered to sign a legal document promising to pay you back. Mom's face flushed. That was different. Different how? Because it was me asking? Because you told me you don't borrow money on principle. Stella, be reasonable. Dad began. Reasonable? I stood up. How were you reasonable when you told me I wasn't college material? When you offered me a waitressing job instead of helping me get an education? When you let Grandpa sell his property to help me while you saved all your money for Grace? That's not fair. Mom protested. What's not fair is that you're only here because you need something from me. You didn't invite me to the engagement party. You haven't spoken to me in years. And now you want $150,000. I walked to the door and opened it. I don't lend money on principle. I believe that's a family tradition, isn't it? Mom's face turned crimson with rage. How dare you throw our words back at us after all we've done for you? All you've done for me? I laughed, a bitter sound. Please, just leave. They stormed out, Mom muttering about ingratitude and Dad avoiding eye contact as I closed the door behind them. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I'd faced them on my own terms, in my own home, from a position of strength. My phone rang again the following day. This time, it was Grace. What is wrong with you? She didn't even bother with a hello. Mom told me what happened. How can you be so selfish? I leaned back in my office chair, watching the sunset through my panoramic windows. Selfish? The irony, coming from you, Grace. We're family, Stella. Family helps each other out. You have the money. Everyone knows you're doing well now. Why won't you help with my wedding? I almost laughed at the absurdity. Family now? Suddenly I'm family? What about when I was over at your house, and you all called me riffraff? When you mocked where I lived? When you laughed at my job? Was I family then? That was different, Grace protested. We were just joking. You're being ridiculous now. What's ridiculous is that none of you spoke to me for years until you needed something. If you need money so badly, why don't you ask our parents? They're your real family, after all. They made that quite clear over the years. Bitter. Ungrateful, Grace exploded. You think you're so much better than us now, with your fancy apartment and your big job. You're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. The line went dead when she hung up. I sat there for a moment, surprised to find that her words no longer stung. They simply tired me. A week later, I was having Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house, a tradition I'd maintained since college. Grandma was unusually quiet as she served the beef stew. Your parents called us yesterday, Grandpa finally said, his voice heavy. I put down my fork. Let me guess. They asked for money for the wedding. Grandma nodded. They're desperate, I think. Your mother had a lot to say about family obligations when we told them we're retired and don't have that kind of money, Grandpa continued. Your mother had the nerve to suggest we sell something. She said, well, you saw the land for Stella's college. She didn't suggest you sell the car? The car I gave you. I was stunned. She actually suggested you sell your gift? That's when I hung up on her, Grandpa said, a glint of satisfaction in his voice. I told her that unlike some people, we don't sell gifts from family members who actually care about us. Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The three of us sat in understanding silence, bound by something stronger than mere blood ties. News travels fast in a small town, and my parents made sure it traveled even faster. Within weeks, their version of events had spread throughout our extended family and social circle. I started hearing snippets of their carefully crafted narrative from various sources. Did you hear about the younger daughter? My mother's friend gossiped loudly in the local supermarket, unaware that I was in the next aisle. Got herself a fancy job and now thinks she's too good for her own family. Doesn't even speak to them anymore. Says they're too poor for her now. At church, Relatives threw disapproving glances my way when I visited with my grandparents. My Aunt Martha called one evening, dripping with judgment. "Your mother told me you wouldn't even let her inside your apartment when she went to visit. How could you treat your own mother like that?" I could have corrected the record. I could have told everyone how my parents had only contacted me when they needed money, how they'd never supported my dreams, how they'd ridiculed and belittled me at every opportunity. But I'd learned a long time ago that trying to defend yourself against toxic people only gives them more ammunition. Instead, I focused on my work, spent time with my grandparents, and let the gossip swirl around me like autumn leaves in the wind. My grandparents knew the truth. They'd lived through every moment with me, and that was enough. But 2 weeks before the wedding, Grace made one last attempt. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, wearing her most expensive outfit and her most convincing smile. "Stella, we need to talk," she said, brushing past me into the living room. "This has gone on long enough. We're sisters. We shouldn't be fighting like this." I stayed by the window, arms crossed, watching her settle onto my sofa as if she owned it. "Why are you really here, Grace?" "To make amends." She gave me her best pageant winner smile. "And to help you understand the situation better. See, Thomas's parents, they're not just rich. They're old money. They have connections everywhere. The wedding has to be perfect." I waited, knowing there was more. "The final payments are due next week. The restaurant deposit, the wedding planner's fee, the flowers." She twisted her engagement ring nervously. "If Mom and Dad can't contribute their share, it's going to be really embarrassing. Thomas's parents will find out they couldn't afford it. It won't just reflect badly on Mom and Dad, it will reflect on me, on my future with Thomas. So this visit isn't really about making amends. It's about the money, isn't it?" "Well, yes, but..." She stood and came closer, putting her hand on my arm. "Stella, please. You're my sister. I need your help. We need to make a good impression on Thomas's parents." I gently removed her hand. I walked to the door and opened it. "I don't care about impressing Thomas's parents. I don't care about your perfect wedding. And I definitely don't care what any of you think anymore." "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You'll regret this." I smiled, feeling genuinely at peace. "No. For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely certain I won't." A few days after Grace's visit, my phone lit up with a text message from Sarah, her friend from college who had always been kind to me. She thought I should know what happened at the country club the night before. "Your parents finally had to come clean with Thomas's family," she wrote. "They couldn't dodge the wedding planner's calls any longer." Apparently, it was quite a scene. I could picture it clearly. The elegant dining room of the country club, Thomas's wealthy parents in their designer clothes, the moment my parents had to admit they couldn't pay their share of the wedding expenses. According to Sarah, Thomas's mother had practically turned purple with rage. The carefully planned fairy tale wedding began to unravel. The honeymoon suite in the Maldives, cancelled. The vintage champagne order, downsized. The designer floral arrangements, simplified. Thomas's parents eventually agreed to cover all the expenses themselves, but the damage was done. The wedding went ahead, albeit scaled down from its original grandeur. I wasn't invited, of course, but I hadn't expected to be. My grandparents received an invitation but declined to attend, sending a polite note about prior commitments. We spent that Saturday together instead, having a picnic in their backyard, steadfastly avoiding any mention of the event taking place across town. A week later, the wedding photos surfaced on social media. I found myself scrolling through them one evening, glass of wine in hand, studying the faces in each carefully curated shot. There was Grace, in her designer dress. Thomas looked stiff and formal, his family arrayed around him like expensive, unhappy statues. And my parents were easy to spot in their new outfits, probably bought on credit, trying so hard to look like they belonged in that world of old money and country club memberships. But their smiles were strained, their poses awkward. Thomas's parents appeared in only a few photos, their expressions ranging from barely concealed disdain to outright disgust. In one particularly telling shot, his mother was captured looking at my parents with the kind of expression usually reserved for something unpleasant found on the bottom of her shoe. Sarah sent occasional updates in the weeks that followed. Grace and Thomas moved into a house his parents had bought them as a wedding gift. My parents rarely visited them. Apparently, they weren't exactly what the Thomas family had envisioned for Sunday dinners. I haven't spoken to my parents or Grace since before the wedding. I doubt I ever will. But sitting here in my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold, I finally feel at peace with that fact. Some bridges, once burned, should remain ash,